You're at a gas station in 2026. The price is higher than last week. You pay. Now split that moment into two versions of yourself. Version 1 holds cash. $9,000. The median American savings balance, according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, 2023. You fill the tank. You drive away. By the end of the month, that $9,000 purchases $230 less than it did in January. The number on the statement has not changed. Its relationship to your life has. Version 2 moved 3 months ago. A portion shifted into energy exposure before the disruption reached the headlines. The price-bleeding version 1 dry is expanding the margin version 2 holds. Same station, same pump, same price. Two outcomes with no shared floor. This changes the outcome. HI viewers, right now, not today, which version are you? Are you sitting in cash, or have you moved into anything that holds when oil runs? Tell me in the comments. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2024, documented that energy categories led every inflation subcategory during every recorded supply disruption cycle, without exception. By the time the Consumer Price Index confirms what you felt at the pump, the transfer has already started. You are not watching the beginning of the event. You are watching its middle. You think this is about gas prices. It is not. It is about which assets the system rewards when energy supply collapses. 4 of them have a documented record. That record is what this video examines. Saving money protects you. That is what every financial framework handed to you confirmed. Set money aside. Let it accumulate. Use it will be there when you need it. The St. Louis Federal Reserve FRED database, 2023, documented what the framework never disclosed. During every recorded inflation cycle, real interest rates turned negative. Your savings account paid 4.5%. Inflation ran at 7%. On a $9,000 balance, that is not protection. That is a $234 annual loss wearing the appearance of stability. And then it stops. Not the inflation. The protection you believed you had. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, 2024, recorded that wages lagged headline inflation by an average of 2.3 percentage points during energy-driven price spikes. On an $80,000 income, that is $1,800 of real compensation lost in a single year, without a single pay cut appearing on your stub. The mechanism is not personal. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, 2022, documented energy cost pass-through to consumer goods within 3 to 6 months of supply disruption, consistent across 1973, 1979, and 1990. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 2023, confirmed indexed pricing systems operate across 40 or more advanced economies as automated functions. They activate regardless of administration, regardless of what your financial advisor said last quarter. You do one of two things when the system moves against your savings. Option A. You trust the framework. By the end of the year, the pass-through completes. The purchasing power is gone. Option B. You recognize the framework was built for a 2% inflation environment. That environment no longer exists. You think this is about personal savings decisions. It is not. It is about system pressure already shaping your outcomes whether you have named it yet or not. You know prices are rising. You feel it at the register, on the utility statement, in the rent notice. And you do what the data says most Americans do. You wait. You monitor. You tell yourself you will act when conditions become clearer. By the time conditions become clearer, the window has closed. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 2022, published research finding that consumers systematically underestimate inflation duration during the early months of a supply shock, adjusting their behavior an average of 5 to 7 months after the disruption, the data already confirmed. Though 5 to 7 months is precisely the full pass-through window the Energy Information Administration, 2024, documented. You waited for clarity. The mechanism completed while you waited. This is where the pattern repeats. You do one of two things under documented financial pressure. Option A. You respond when the CPI confirms inflation. You act. The BlackRock Investment Institute, 2022, data shows real asset classes had already outperformed nominal assets by 22 percentage points during the documented high inflation period. You captured the tail of the move. Option B. You understand the documented lag is structural, not informational. The 3 to 6 month transmission window is not a delay. It is the positioning window. On a $9,000 savings balance, The difference between entering a commodity-correlated position in month 1 versus month 6 of an oil shock cycle represents approximately $1,400 of foregone real return, based on Federal Reserve historical commodity price data for the 1973 and 1979 shock periods. $1,400. The decision to wait cost more than most people spent responding. The behavioral trap is not ignorance. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 2022, documented that households most likely to delay action during inflation cycles carried the highest financial literacy scores, not the lowest. The trap is a timing deficit dressed as caution. You think this is about behavior. It is not. It is about structural design. And you are already inside it. The Strait of Hormuz closes on a Tuesday. By Thursday, oil futures have moved. Led by the following Monday, supply contracts across 40 economies have already repriced. You learn about it on Wednesday of the third week, when the headline confirms what the mechanism already completed. This is not temporary. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 2023, confirmed indexed pricing systems across 40 or more advanced economies operate as structural functions, not adjustable responses. They do not require a vote. They activate on commodity benchmarks embedded in contracts written years before the disruption occurred. The household waiting for a policy intervention is waiting for a decision the system was explicitly designed to not require. You do one of two things when you understand this. Option A. You continue looking for the intervention, a rate decision, a strategic reserve release, like a diplomatic resolution. The International Energy Agency, 2026, released the largest emergency stockpile in its history following the Hormuz closure. The daily shortfall was 15 million barrels. The release covered 4.5 million per day. The gap did not close. Option B. You stop looking for the intervention and start looking at what the system rewards when none arrives. 4 assets held their value or gained it when no intervention was sufficient. Gold moved from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $850 by January 1980, a 2,328% increase, according to Federal Reserve historical price records. American farmland tracked by the United States Department of Agriculture rose from $137 per acre in 1970 to $737 by 1980. Energy equities returned 5 times what the S&P 500 delivered across the decade. Short-term Treasury bills preserved purchasing power, while long-term bonds collapsed under fixed yields inflation consumed year by year. The World Bank Commodity Markets Outlook, 2022, estimated those 3 oil shock decades redistributed $2.1 trillion in effective purchasing power, consistently favoring real asset holders over nominal savers. The window that preceded each transfer closed exactly when the mainstream press confirmed what the mechanism already completed. The bill does not arrive the month the disruption starts. It arrives 6 months later, when you have already adjusted to the new price level and stopped expecting relief. You're a household earning $80,000 annually in the second half of 2026. The Consumer Price Index has now confirmed the full pass-through cycle. Your grocery bill is up. Your utility statement is up. Your rent notice arrived higher than last year. None of this happened at once. It arrived in installments, each one small enough to absorb, each one permanent enough to compound. The cost arrives late. Then it stays. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2024, recorded that on an $80,000 income, in a sustained 6% inflation environment removes nearly $5,000 of purchasing power annually, not in a single event, but in a continuous, invisible draw that does not appear as a line item on any statement. By the end of year 1, $5,000 is gone. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, 2023, documented that middle-income households had not recovered their pre-shock purchasing power baseline 2 years after the disruption. They had simply stopped measuring the gap. It was always building. You do one of two things when the delayed cost becomes visible. Option A. You cut subscriptions, reduce grocery categories, delay repairs. The National Bureau of Economic Research, 2022, documented that households following cost reduction strategies during inflationary cycles recovered an average of 31% of their purchasing power loss through behavioral adjustment. 31%. The other 69% remained in the system that collected it. Option B. You recognize that the delayed arrival was the documented transmission cycle running on schedule. You positioned before the bill arrived. On a $9,000 savings balance entering the cycle unpositioned, Federal Reserve historical data for the 1973 to 1975 period shows a real purchasing power loss of approximately 22% across 24 months. That is $1,980 lost without a transaction, without a withdrawal, and without a decision you consciously made. You think this is where the damage stops. It is not. It compounds. And the next phase has already started. The inflation rate drops from 7% to 4.2%. The financial press calls it cooling. Your grocery bill stops rising at the rate it was. For 3 months, the pressure feels like it is lifting. It is not lifting. The gap is widening. You do one of two things when visible indicators improve. Option A. You register the improvement and return to pre-disruption behavior. You rebuild the savings account. You stop monitoring positions you entered or considered. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, 2024, documented that real household purchasing power during post-shock stabilization recovered an average of 1.4% annually, while the cumulative loss from the shock period averaged 8.6%. The recovery does not catch the loss. What's option B? You examine the underlying data rather than the headline number. Inflation cooling from 7 to 4.2 is not a return to baseline. It is a slower rate of departure from a baseline already compromised. It looks stable. It is not stable. The Federal Reserve Distributional Financial Accounts, 2023, documented that during the post-1979 stabilization period, households in the bottom 2 wealth quintiles experienced a secondary purchasing power contraction, even as headline inflation moderated. Consumer credit outstanding tracked by the Federal Reserve G.19 report rose 14.8% during the 12 months following the 1979 shock as households used credit to bridge the gap between nominal income and real cost of living. 7 years later, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 2023, documented that households entering revolving credit during inflationary spikes carried that debt an average of 6.3 years before resolution. The oil shock of 2026 is still extracting payment in 2032 from households that believed the crisis ended in 2027. The gap is widening. The illusion of recovery does not require anyone to intend the outcome. It only requires the household to re-enter the default position. Cash, credit, the conventional savings framework, before the compounding completes. Gold, farmland, energy equity, and short-term government instruments did not correct sharply when the 1973 and 1979 shocks stabilized. They held. You think progress means recovery? It does not. It delays collapse, and the system depends on that delay. The rent is due. The credit balance has not moved in 4 months. You're earning what you earned before the disruption, but the money reaches fewer places. So you do what most households under sustained pressure do. You increase income exposure. You take the additional shift. You add the side work. The decision feels right. The outcome is worse. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, 2024, documented that average weekly hours worked among full-time employees rose 3.2% during the 12 months following the 2022 inflationary peak. Real hourly compensation, adjusted for inflation, fell during the same period. More hours. Less purchasing power per hour. The gap did not close. This is the trap. You do one of two things under sustained financial pressure. Option A. You increase labor output. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta Wage Growth Tracker, 2023, documented median wage growth for job stayers at 5.5% annually during the post-shock period, against a 7.1% inflation rate. The treadmill accelerated. The distance covered did not. Option B. You reduce the extraction point, the cash position, rather than increasing the input. 2 weeks after adding the extra shift, $400 enters the gross monthly income. At 6% inflation, that delivers $376 of real value. The National Bureau of Economic Research, 2022, found that households relying primarily on income growth to recover inflation losses required an average of 4.1 additional years to return to pre-shock purchasing power compared to households adjusting asset positioning in the disruption's first year. 4.1 years. On an $80,000 income, that is over $300,000 of cumulative earnings passing through an inflating system before the gap closed. You think you are adapting. You are not. You are reinforcing the system that limits you. 15 years later, the outcome is no longer a projection. It is the statement in front of you at 53 years old, showing a net worth of $218,000. The median for your age bracket, according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, 2022, is $214,000 for households that did not hold real assets during the documented inflationary periods they lived through. You are exactly where the data said you would be. The window is closed. You do one of two things at this point in the documented arc. Option A. You accept the outcome and optimize what remains. You increase the savings rate. You extend the working years. The Employee Benefit Research Institute, 2023, documented that households entering retirement with assets below 3 times final income require an average of 7 additional working years to reach Social Security full retirement age with adequate reserves, assuming no further inflationary disruption occurs. Option B. You attempt late correction. You shift into commodity-correlated positions at 53. You have not lost the mechanism. You have lost the compounding years that would have made it fully effective. One decision ago, the number would be different. The Federal Reserve Distributional Financial Accounts, 2023, documented that a household entering a real asset position in the first year of an oil shock cycle and holding it for 10 years accumulated an average net worth 47% higher at the decade's end than an equivalent household that remained in nominal savings instruments throughout. On a starting position of $9,000, that divergence compounds to approximately $61,000 of additional net worth over 10 years, without additional income, without a higher savings rate, and without any mechanism beyond the documented performance differential between real and nominal assets during inflationary decades. The gap is permanent. At retirement, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, 2023, documented that households in the bottom 2 net worth quintiles at age 65 spent an average of 14 additional working years to close the gap that a single repositioning decision during their first documented inflationary cycle would have prevented. 14 years, not of recovery, of working years that could have been retirement years, spent inside a system that had already completed its documented transfer without their participation. There is no reset. Each documented oil shock cycle opened a positioning window that lasted 3 to 6 months before the pass-through completed. The households that entered that window held ground. The households that waited lost it. Not in a crash, not in a scandal, not in a decision that felt dangerous at the time. In a series of reasonable, responsible, conventional choices made inside a framework the system had already outgrown. You think this was about choices. It was not. It was about timing, structure, and compounding forces already in motion, running on a documented schedule, producing documented outcomes for the 4th time in the same direction. Your grandfather waited in a gas line in 1973 and called it a shortage. Your father watched his savings lose purchasing power in 1979 and called it inflation. Neither of them had a name for the mechanism producing both outcomes. The vocabulary was not made available to them, or it was not offered. The system does not take your money. It changes what your money can do. The distinction is not semantic. It is the entire architecture. This is the economic records. That we exist to examine these systems before they finish their work, to identify the patterns that determine financial outcomes long before those outcomes arrive. The ledger always balances. It has balanced in the same direction for 3 generations. This channel exists to make sure it does not balance that way for a 4th.